I'd like to introduce, and I have the pleasure of introducing, Pastor Brian D. McLaren, author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. A former college English teacher and pastor, he is a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, just generous and working with people of all faiths for the common good. He is a core faculty member of the Living School and podcaster with Learning How to See, which are part of the Center for Action and Contemplation. He is also an Auburn Senior Fellow and is a co-host of Southern Lights. His newest books are Faith After Doubt and Do I Stay Christian, May 2022. A frequent guest on TV, radio, and news media programs, he has appeared on All Things Considered, Larry King Live, Nightline, On Being, and Religion, and Ethics News Weekly. His work has been covered in Time, New York Times, Christianity Today, Christian Century, The Washington Post, The Huffington Post, CNN.com, and many other print and online media. And we are so thankful that in addition to all those amazing sources, we can welcome him here into the Village at Orchard Ridge. Without further ado, Pastor McLaren.
Happy to be with you all here, and my first time to this beautiful facility, and it just seems like a lovely place with lovely people, and I've been so warmly welcomed. I would like to talk to you tonight about my most recent book, courtesy of my friend Ron here, who loaned me his copy. It's called Do I Stay Christian? And the most common question I'm asked when people want to talk to me about this book is, well, why did you write a book like this? And as you just heard, I began my career as a college English teacher. I was a teacher at University of Maryland and several other colleges in the DC area. And in the 1970s and 80s, when I was in my undergraduate and graduate years, we were still in a period of time where in a lot of public intellectual life, there was a kind of feeling that smart people would not be Christian. And to admit that you were a committed Christian sort of made you not seem quite up to par in the intellectual setting. So really my early life as a Christian, when I was a college English teacher, I never thought I was going to become a pastor. I was happy teaching, but I was aware that there was a sense that so much of Christianity had become anti-intellectual and was not welcoming the life of the mind. I ended up becoming a pastor and leaving my teaching career. And during my years as a pastor, I had an interdenominational congregation where we attracted two kinds of people. We attracted people who were on their way out of Christianity, and we were their last stop on the inside. They had given up on whatever they had been raised with, and they were hoping that we might be able to provide a place for them to stay Christian. And then we also had people who were on the outside, but were exploring their faith, and we were a place that felt welcoming to them. They didn't feel like they needed to get a new passport in order to come into our congregation. So my whole career has been lived at the edge between the world of faith and the world of more skeptical, greater skepticism. I began writing when I was a pastor about that intersection, and really my writing career has involved me with people who are on that edge. There was a brilliant Episcopal priest who actually played an underappreciated role in the formation of Alcoholics Anonymous. His name was Samuel Shoemaker. And he wrote a beautiful poem called I Stand by the Door. And in the poem, he describes how he doesn't want to go in too far, because some of the people way in the world of religion scare him. and he doesn't want to go too far out, because he knows there's something inside that's important to him. And I suppose that's been part of my experience too. But in the last 16 years since I left the pastorate, almost 17 years, it's been clear to me that more and more younger people with more education are leaving the church. And this goes for Catholic, for Protestant. Among Roman Catholics, it's a little hard to know the exact statistics because in the Catholic Church, they don't, the records are not public, what number of parishioners are recent immigrants and what number are long-term, are people who've lived here their whole lives. But Catholic sociologist friends of mine tell me that the situation is similar or worse than in mainline Protestantism, where there has been a decline in church attendance, steady decline, since the 1960s. It was as if after World War II, there was a bump in church attendance. It reached its peak for mainline Protestants, meaning Lutherans, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, and so on. And then it started declining. And the declines have been faster at times, slower at times, but the numbers have been declining. I grew up in a very conservative fundamentalist background, and for me, becoming an evangelical was a move to being way more liberal. But among evangelicals, they considered themselves the exception. Their numbers were holding strong. But just after the turn of the century, the numbers there started on a decline in church attendance, baptisms, whatever measurements were being used. And my friend, your fellow Virginian, Diana Butler Bass, calls what's happened in the first part of the 21st century the Great Religious Recession. There's been a decline in most of the West. Now, if you read the statistics in the global South, especially in Africa and Latin America, those statistics don't hold. But largely that's due to high birth rates. And when you take away that high birth rate differential, the situation is more complicated than people think. I'll just tell you a quick story about this. I was in Kampala, Uganda, about 10 years ago, and I was one of only maybe 2 or 3 foreigners, or let's say non-Africans. I was a guest there of my African friends who were organizing this conference. And I would say there were, 200-300, mostly clergy. And what was unusual is it included Catholic and Protestant, Pentecostal and Anglican, a wide array of Christian clergy and lay leaders. At the end of the conference, a Ugandan woman came up to me and said, could I interview you? I'm a reporter from the Kampala newspaper. So it's a secular newspaper. I'm just writing on this event for the paper. I said, sure. So she had a little, remember those little tiny micro cassette recorders? She had one of those. And so she pressed and said, ask me some questions. Then she clicked it off. And she said, and I should say, I'd given one talk, I think, at this event. She clicked it off and said, I have one more question. It's not for my article, it's for me. I said, what's that? She said, do you really have any hope for Christianity? And I said, well, I do, but I'm really interested in why you asked the question. She said, I'm a reporter. Let me tell you about my last couple religion stories. And she went on to tell about a preacher, Pentecostal preacher, who stood in front of his congregation and said, God has revealed to me that someone here has HIV. Well, a high percentage of people have HIV. It didn't take supernatural knowledge to know that. And he said, and you have been praying for a healing, and you have not been healed. And of course, you can imagine a lot of people there who had HIV had been praying for healing. And he said, if that describes you, I want you to come and see me after the service today. So I don't know how many people came to see him, but one of them was a widow who came and said, I have HIV. I contracted it from my husband. He died. I've been praying for a healing, and I have not received it. And the pastor said, the Lord has revealed to me, you own land, and your land is cursed. She said, well, I do own the land that my husband farmed. He said, you must give this land to the man of God, meaning himself. So this trusting woman found the deed to her land, signed it over to the minister. And so this reporter is telling me this story and then says, and then what happened was when the woman's brothers heard what this preacher had done, one of them tried to kill him. And I guess his attempt failed. And so now this minister travels around with an entourage of armed bodyguards. She said, you can see why I don't have much hope for Christianity in Uganda. Can you feel that? Of course you can. Because here in the United States, we have scandal after scandal. And we have religious leaders behaving badly and embarrassingly again and again. You may have heard today, a new report came out of the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church in France. And now a whole new round of people have been identified. And it's terribly disturbing that children were molested and sexually abused, and equally horrible that fellow leaders in the church covered up for their brothers. And so this struggle in the world of Christian faith is real, and a lot of people are leaving for a whole wide array of reasons. And that really was the genesis behind this book. But I should tell you, what was the added nudge for me is over the last 17 years, I've spent most of my time speaking to clergy. And the number of clergy who are leaving is quite surprising too. I remember the way one clergy person said it to me. He said, look, I see behind the curtain every week, and what I see is not pretty, he said. And he said, I thought that becoming a minister would help me strengthen my faith. He said, it's been the hardest thing for me to keep my faith because of what I see so often going on behind the scenes. And so those were the reasons behind writing this book. Well, then came the challenge, what am I going to say? and how should I address this question? So what I decided to do is to divide the book into 3 sections. The title, Do I Stay Christian? Part 1 is no. And I tried to articulate the 10 of the best reasons I could think of for people to leave Christian faith. And you might be surprised that I would do that, having been a pastor myself. But I'd like to explain something to you. I used to be worried that too many people would leave Christian faith and the Christian church would dwindle and disappear. I'm less worried about that now than that too many people will perpetuate harmful versions of the Christian faith and will do such harm and damage that so many people will suffer. Now you might say, how could that be? Well, let's just say this. If any other organization in the world had as strong a history of the abuse of children as the Christian faith, and by the way, it's not just Catholics. Protestants have their history too. If any religious institution had the history of what happened in the boarding schools here in North America with Native Americans, Catholic, Protestant. If any other institution had the track record that our Christian religious institutions have had, it would be seen as a crime network, and it would be rejected. So it's not just that. It's not just our past. I have a high view of science, and the same science that, for example, I live in Southwest Florida where Hurricane Ian hit, and the same science that's incredibly accurate in predicting, letting you know that a hurricane is coming, and the same science that was incredibly accurate in telling us about the dangers of COVID. And some people say, well, they kept changing their story. Well, that's because the virus kept changing and the science was good enough to keep up with those changes. That same science tells us that climate change is real. And a lot of people don't believe this, but I get emails like this so regularly, where devout, sincere, committed Christians say, Jesus is coming back soon. Why should we worry about caring about the earth? In other words, we might as well use it up and return it empty. And so this sense that, or another one, God would never let that happen. That kind of thinking, you understand, the death toll of that kind of thinking over the next 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, could even surpass some of the worst atrocities in the past. So I felt I didn't want to minimize those first 10 chapters. I wanted to be as honest as I possibly could. And a lot of people who've told me who read the book have told me that those first 10 chapters were not an easy read. And I don't want them to be. But a lot of people have also said, why did I never hear this before? So I'll just do a quick read through from the table of contents of those first 10 chapters. The first chapter is because Christianity has been vicious to its mother. By the end of the first century, the first signs of Christian anti-Semitism were arising. And that theme of Christian anti-Semitism continued to rise through the rest of through the first century into the second century, and then has just been a steady drumbeat in many sectors of Christianity. Once I was late to a meeting at my church, and I was running out of my house trying to make up for lost time. And just as I get to my car, my neighbor who is Jewish called out, "Hey, Brian, you got a minute?" I said, I'm really running late. She says, "I just need a minute." I said, "Okay." She came over. She said, "Brian, I spent the morning listening to Christian radio." I said, "Eileen, why do you do that? I don't even listen to Christian radio. It drives me nuts." She said, "It wasn't for inspiration. It was for surveillance purposes." She said, "Every preacher I heard said, 'We're going to take this country back for Jesus.'" And she said, "Do they understand how that makes a Jewish mother feel? When I know what's happened to Jews in Christian-dominated countries through the centuries," she said, "it makes me think maybe I should move to Canada." Now, the people who are saying that on those radio stations have no idea. Most of them don't know about the Christian history of anti-Semitism. But in a pandemic, it's a good time for us to educate ourselves, because there have been a lot of pandemics in the first 2,000 years of Christian history. All through the Middle Ages, you remember, there was the Black Death, the bubonic plague. There was a whole succession of plagues and pandemics that, for example, in parts of Germany, over 50% of the population was killed, a significant percentage directly by the disease, but another significant percentage because when so many people were sick, they didn't get out to plant the fields. And when the fields didn't get planted, the next winter there was famine. It was a cascade of impacts of pandemics. A lot of people don't know that absolutely predictably, when a pandemic would spread across Europe, Christians would blame the Jews. And there would be pogroms, there would be roundups of Jews, and there would be mass killings, and there would be banishments. And I tell just one of those stories in the book. I have to tell you, I have dear friends who are rabbis, and they are more afraid about living in the United States now than they've been in their lifetimes, because they see a rise of Christian anti-Semitism here in the United States. And of course, there are versions of it in Italy and Poland and many other places as well. But that was the first, and it's very, very significant. And I remember when so I bet a lot of you, some of you maybe have memories from the 1940s. You know, I grew up in the 1950s, and I remember the first time I heard the word Holocaust. And I came home from school and I said to my mother, "What is the Holocaust?" And when she told me, I just couldn't believe that, 10 years or so before I was born, this was going on. And you realize that every Jewish parent has to tell their children that this was in the past. And now, imagine the anxiety. I was, in 2017, I was down the road in Charlottesville. The clergy who organized a clergy response to the Unite the Right rally there asked me if I would come up. And so I came, and I will never forget that day. I never thought I would see people marching down the streets of an American city carrying Nazi flags and chanting anti-Semitic slogans. And so the Christian faith has some very, very serious work to do in facing its history of anti-Semitism. Isn't it sad that many sectors of the Christian faith are much more worried about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered people than they are about the anti-Semites in their own congregations? The second chapter was because of Christianity's suppression of dissent. And I put these chapters in something of historical order, because it wasn't long after Christians were violent and cruel to their Jewish neighbors that they also became violent and cruel to their fellow Christians who were doctrinal nonconformists. And so there's an ugly history of what Christians did in the name of God, in the name of Jesus, in the name of the Trinity, in the name of the Bible, to their fellow Christians when those Christians didn't agree with them on doctrine or a practice. There was a section in that chapter where I just tried to give a brief summary of the torture techniques used by the church in the Middle Ages. And my editor, after she read it, said, "I don't think you should include that." She said, "That put images in my mind that make me sick and that I can't sleep because they have stayed in my mind." And I said, "Well, I feel this has to be told somewhere." So we moved that to the appendix with a kind of trigger warning. But this is a part of our Christian history that we have to tell the truth about. Next is because of Christianity's high global death toll and life toll. And I put the Crusades and colonialism together in that section of the book, because you could say the Crusades, in the 12th century, in a sense, lasted for a couple of centuries. And yet, right around the time that the Crusades ended, the colonial era began. And this was a long-standing tradition of violence in the Christian faith. Then I talked about because of Christianity's loyal company men, the problem of institutionalism, the problem of people protecting abusers, the problem of people making decisions that are best for the institution, even though those decisions harm other people. Next was because of Christianity's real master. This is about the relationship of the Christian faith to money, not only through history, but today. So much, books could be written about this. So much we could talk about there. Next was because of the White Christian Old Boys Network, which is the issue of white patriarchy. And I decided to put those together because the domination, the fact that white men have been the dominant leaders of Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and the impact this has had on women. In 1452, a series of documents were produced by Christian leaders that are collectively known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And this was the permission slip for the kings of Europe to travel around the world. And you'll find this hard to believe, but this is an exact quote from the first of those documents that was given to the King of Portugal and then was spread to Spain, France, and other European countries, to go into all the world and make slaves of all nations and reduce people to perpetual slavery. And it was an image of Christian domination that emerged in that century. That Christian domination became equated with European domination and has played a far greater role in our history than many of us are aware of. Seventh is a chapter about toxic theology. Eighth is because of a lack of transformation, measurable transformation in people's lives. Ninth is because of what I call constricted intellectualism, that the intellectual life of many Christian communities is it's very intense, but very focused on maintaining what people already think. And then this is one that folks our age understand, because Christianity is a sinking, shrinking ship of wrinkling people. And so you might say after those 10 chapters, why would anybody want to stay Christian? When I got to the end of those 10 chapters, I felt it was even more important to go into the second part of the book, which is called Yes. Is it possible to have your eyes wide open to these 10 serious problems of Christian identity, to not try to minimize them, not try to say they don't really matter, or to not try to be in denial and say they didn't really happen or aren't really happening, but to say, looking at those things with eyes wide open, are there reasons to stay Christian? So part 2 is where I try to explore some of those reasons to stay Christian. I'll just summarize a few of those chapters. Because leaving hurts allies and helps their opponents. There are so many wonderful people doing so many wonderful things in the Christian faith. In the last few years, I've been working with Franciscan nuns in a very exciting project. And I've just got to tell you, these are some of the finest human beings you could ever imagine. Not only generous and kind, but incredibly smart and scholarly, and some of the funniest people I've ever met as well. And you just think, in a sense, every one of us who gives up because of the people doing harmful things, in a sense, we're also withdrawing our support from the people doing wonderful things. And that's something that I think we have to try to take seriously. Second, because leaving defiantly and staying compliantly are not our only options. And in that chapter, I tell the story of a couple of nun friends of mine who got a letter from the Vatican saying that they were under investigation. And it was terrifying for them. And you can imagine how it felt for nuns to be under investigation for who are just doing incredible good works for the poor when a lot of their male counterparts were not under investigation for some of the things they were doing. But this one nun in particular said to me, well, if they kick me out, I'm not going quietly. And it was her way of saying that I love the church enough that I'm going to speak the truth that I know I need to speak. I think of another nun. She was in her 90s when she told me this. She said, in the 1960s, when Vatican II happened, she said, that's when I began my ministry. And she said, I was so excited. It was such an exciting time. And she said, the truth is, most of my fellow nuns thought, within a few years, we'll be able to teach and preach and maybe even administer the sacraments, because change was in the air. And she said to me, if you told me that I would be 92 years old and farther away from that dream coming true, I never would have believed you. But her attitude was not because of that she's giving up. Her attitude was, in the years that I have left, I'm going to continue to speak what I believe needs to be spoken. Next chapter I talked about, because where else would I go? Here's what I think, as soon as you start to think about these problems in the Christian faith, you find out that there's very similar institutional struggle in just about every institution of life. Christianity has a serious problem with sexual abuse. It's sure nice that Hollywood doesn't have that problem. It's sure nice that politicians don't have that problem. You understand? Suddenly we realize these are problems that turn up everywhere. And in the world of religion, in the world of education, in the world of business, suddenly we realize our whole human species we're having to face some ugly things about ourselves. And if I decide I will leave every group that I'm embarrassed about, I'm really in trouble because I'm a bit embarrassed about myself. So next, because it would be a shame to leave a religion in its infancy. You might say, well, 2,000 years doesn't seem like infancy. But you could also say that in many ways, we human beings change very, very slowly. Sometimes it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Sometimes it's 3 steps forward, 4 steps back. But could we be at a place where, in a certain sense, immaturities in our religious community are now becoming so ugly, we may have a chance to decide to grow up. Next, because of our legendary founder. And this is, in many ways, the central chapter of the book. But the interesting thing, speaking for myself, but for so many other people who have talked to me, they say, I'm really disillusioned with Christianity, but I think Jesus is amazing. And I would like to keep following Jesus. I just wish I didn't have to be a Christian in order to do that. But I think this sense that out of loyalty to Jesus, there is a desire to express solidarity with others. Well, that's the next chapter. It's a chapter, if we just wanted to discuss one chapter, it would be the one I would discuss tonight. It's because innocence is an addiction and solidarity is the cure. And I think what happens is we start to feel this group that I'm a part of, I feel is polluted. And I don't want to be associated with it because I want to be innocent. I want to think of myself as innocent. But when you start imagining what people do because they feel innocent or in order to feel innocent, you start realizing that innocence is a kind of seductive drug for adults. And I explore that in that chapter. In the remaining chapters in this second section, I just talk about the fact that we human beings are at an inflection point in our development as a species and as a global civilization. And the fact is, something like 83% of people in the world identify with a religion. And every one of those religions is facing real internal struggles. And so if I want to write off all religion, then in a certain sense, I'm writing off 83% of the world's population. And maybe it would be smarter, if this is my background, to say to have solidarity with my fellow humans is to have solidarity also in our struggle to help our religions move forward. And then the last two chapters are to free God. This is a huge subject. You might want to ask a question or two about it in a couple of minutes, but in many ways, I'll just tell you this because I love theology. I'm a kind of theological nerd. But what has happened in the last 120 years of Christian theology is absolutely breathtakingly exciting. There are such exciting new breakthroughs in Christian theology. Oh my goodness, you go back a little over 100 years ago, a brilliant Jesuit named Teilhard de Chardin had some breakthroughs that were absolutely historic. Way too few people have heard of his amazing breakthroughs, where instead of fighting against evolution, he said, maybe we should look at evolution as a feature of the universe and therefore something that helps us understand God in new ways, not to mention ourselves. And oh my goodness, about 100 years ago, the social gospel movement that explodes here in this country through Walter Rauschenbusch and then is picked up with so many others. And then in the mid-century, when black theology and feminist theology and indigenous theology and Latinx liberation theology, when all of these theologies expressed by people who had been colonized by white Christians, in a certain sense, nobody was giving them permission to do their own theology, but they started doing it without permission. And I'll just tell you, as a guy thoroughly raised and indoctrinated in white European Christianity, my faith has been enriched by the explosion of indigenous and what white people would call minority theologians, but of course that just reflects our bias. Oh my goodness, what an exciting time. So freeing God in the midst of this, freeing God from many assumptions that it's time to stop caging God within, I think is an exciting thing happening. And then the last chapter in that section is called Because of Fermi's Paradox and the Great Filter, which I won't go into now except to say this. I think you can bank on it. Like while we're sitting here, some people are glued to their television sets watching election results roll in, right? And some will be happy and some will be unhappy with the results. But I think we can pretty much, predictions are very risky, but I think we can pretty much predict that there are dangerous elements in our country, in our world, in our religion that are not going to be better tomorrow. They're going to get a lot worse. And we keep hoping this is the bottom. I think we'd be smart to say, this is not the bottom. The bottom could be a lot worse. When I was in Charlottesville in 2017, I thought it couldn't get worse. And then on January 6th, I thought, well, it can't get a lot worse. I think we should expect that there are things that are set free, that are in motion in our world and in our culture, that they're going to get worse until the conditions change. But here's the thing. As some people and some things and some movements get worse, how will other people respond? They'll say, I don't want to be part of that. I want to do something constructive and beautiful and healing in response. And this is the interesting thing for us to say. My choice is, do I where do I throw in my energies? Where do I live with my energies? So that's the second part of the book. The no section, the yes section, and then the third section, I basically say, listen, some people are going to stay Christian, some people aren't. Either way, you have to wake up tomorrow and decide how you want to live. And this deeper question of how we want to live is, to me, the question that I'm driven to as I face these realities. And so I offer in that section 8 chapters that I think anyone who decides to stay Christian or decides I can't stay Christian anymore, I think any morally serious person will want to take those 8 chapters seriously. And I don't think I will take time now to go into any of them in detail, except to say that they all focus on issues that we have to work out in ourselves. It's not how we demand other people get straight and fix things. It's how we all say, in this moment, I'm going to lean into the direction of the kind of humanity and the kind of Christianity that I think the world really needs. We'll open up for questions in just a minute, but I'll just say one of the blessings of my life in the last 15 years or so has been being part of a multi-faith fellowship where some Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Sikh, we don't actually have any Hindu leaders in our group at this point, but a little group of us became friends many years ago, and we made a commitment for, 7 or 8 years. We spent 2 or 3 days together twice a year on a retreat. We just said, we've got to have some place where Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and so on have relationships with each other, where we know each other. So we don't just talk about each other to people in our own religion, but we talk to each other. And those friendships have been so deep. But here's what I can tell you. Every religious community I have any connection to is facing their own struggles now. If you are Buddhist and you are aware of what has been happening in Myanmar or Burma in recent years, where the Buddhist majority has, in a sense, tried to at least marginalize, and some people would say, begin genocide against the Muslim minority in Myanmar. It's not a pretty picture. If you're Muslim and you watch what's happening this week and in recent weeks in Iran, and you think about the struggle of women to be treated as equals and to be treated with respect, and the huge weight of religious oppression on women, you realize, oh my goodness, these struggles are everywhere. My rabbi, I think of a couple of my dear rabbi friends, and they wake up every morning both wanting to be sure their people are protected from this resurgence of anti-Semitism, but also being deeply ashamed of the way the government of Israel treats the Palestinian people. And feeling brokenhearted to watch the leaders of the nation, the state of Israel, in a sense, do unto others as had been done unto them, rather than as they would have been done unto them. And so they wake up with that struggle day after day. And so suddenly when I realize that something larger, I think, is happening. The Buddhist scholar Joanna Macy called it a great turning, that the human species is at this point where we're having to change the way we relate to one another, and especially across lines of difference. And we're having to change the way we relate to the earth itself. And in order to make those changes, we're having to change the way we relate to ourselves and the way we tend and take care of and educate ourselves. And in fact, probably you all being here tonight is part of your commitment to that ongoing development too. So let me stop there. Thank you for your attention, and we'll open up for some questions. Thank you. Well, I imagine that the first thing you probably did, your first name again? David, the first thing you probably did, David, is you empathized. You didn't say to them, you shouldn't feel that way. You helped affirm that there were reasons they felt that way, and you affirmed that. I think that's our starting point. The second thing I'd say is there are some people who I think we have to give them permission to distance themselves from the Christian faith. Look, this is just a principle of dealing with abuse and trauma. If a person is being abused, you get them away from the abuser. And people need that kind of distance. It's interesting to me that there are structures or there are spaces that are being created for people who need to get away from traditional structures. So I think about how many people find a spiritual director, or how many people find a retreat center where they go for retreats. I'm involved with the Center for Action and Contemplation, and it becomes a place where a lot of people who felt that they had to distance themselves from traditional organized religion at least can continue to get their souls cared for and fed in some way. And sometimes it's people just forming little circles of friends, and those circles of friends try to start to provide that. So sometimes people need to get some distance. But I suppose my elevator pitch, this better be a tall building to get to the top of the elevator here, but my elevator pitch would just be, I know how you feel, and I want to do everything I can to provide an alternative image of what it means to be a Christian. I would like to do that in the way I live. And at the end of the day, I think if there aren't enough of us who are living a positive example, then we shouldn't be surprised when more people leave. If I can say it this way, when religious bigotry is loud and religious ignorance is shouting at the top of its lungs, I don't think we have to outshout them, but I think we have to live loudly. And one of the things, in fact, a group of us were talking about this afternoon, is I think we need to learn the courage to differ graciously. And what I mean by that is, you hear that this religious leader said or did this, more and more of us have to speak up and just say, I know they said that, I know they did that, I'm not that way, I don't support that. Here's what I support instead. The chapter in the book near the end where I talk about this, I call it renounce and announce. We have to say, I renounce all forms of anti-Semitism, and I'm for loving all of my neighbors as myself, whatever their religion, and no exceptions. You know, that kind of a thing. So I think we invite people into that space, but it starts though with empathizing with why they feel that way. Oh my goodness, it's an important question. Yes, does everybody feel the intensity of that question? Thanks for that question, Joan. Yeah, I think Charlottesville and January 6th tell us that you can wake up one morning and find out there's a lot more violence seething underneath the surface than you realized, you know. And so I think there will be, I think the anger that's being stoked and the fear that's being stoked, I don't think it's just going to go away or dissipate. I think what is going to happen, Well, and I would expect if the anger and violence grows on one side, we should expect to see an equal and opposite reaction. And that's not a pretty picture. So I think what that means is that those of us who believe that we need peaceful resolution rather than violent resolution of our tensions are going to have to stop acting like we're the norm, and we're going to have to start acting like we have a case to make and we need to make it. And it's very hard to do, but I think one of the ways, in fact, you'll never read a book on leadership that recommends what I'm about to say, but I call this leading with anxiety. And so your neighbor says something angry and offensive that just feels like it raises the level. And leading with anxiety says, boy, when I hear you talk like that, it really makes me afraid. It really makes me worried that we're going to keep ratcheting up the anger until it takes us places we don't want to go. Now, I think why a statement like that can be useful is because it's an I statement, not a you statement. You shouldn't talk like that. As soon as you say that, egos are engaged and people are going to fight back. But if you say, I'm worried and I'm afraid and here's what I'm afraid about, in a sense what it does is it allows a person who's being told to be afraid of different things to now think, wow, maybe I should be afraid of that too. And when people are in a fear mode, the last thing you can tell them is calm down. Something else has to help them get out of that mode. So I hope that helps. I just think there are, especially those of us who are older, we can get away with this. You hear your kid or your grandkid say something and you say, oh dear, I love you so much. I love you so much. And I hate to think that you'll end up in a world of more violence and hate and fear. I hate to think about that because I love you so much. You know, it's a way of, in a sense, proactively bringing something new to the equation other than just more conflict. Yeah, thanks for that. For those of you who don't know who Tripp Fuller is, I'll just tell you another one of these amazingly historic things has been happening over the last, I don't know how long Tripp's been going, 9 years, maybe 10 years. But a young seminarian, something like 10 years ago, named Tripp Fuller, decided he would start a podcast where he would bring the world's greatest living theologians into conversation. And Tripp is this sort of down-home guy with a southern accent, wicked smart, but just as down-home and, you know, fun person as you could ask. And so he gets the greatest living theologians to be on his show, and he asks them questions that gets them talking, and in a sense takes the kind of theological education that you used to have to go into $40,000 of debt in a seminary in order to get. And there are hundreds of hours of this incredible theological content. If you are interested, it's called Homebrewed Christianity. It's all free. It's just amazing resource. Let me maybe try to respond to that by saying something about Jesus. And so if we want to go back and look at our founder, one way to understand Jesus, by the way, we've had 2,000 years of Christian history that tried to understand Jesus through the lens of philosophy. And we had big debates. For example, our Trinitarian debates were debates that, in a sense, we were trying to make sense of Jesus within the categories of Greek philosophy. And nothing wrong with that, that's fine. But something that's happening now is we're trying to rediscover Jesus as a man in history. And so when you go back and you look at the first century, what's called Second Temple Judaism, one of the things you realize is that, in fact, scholars say this routinely. They say in Jesus' day, there was no such thing as Judaism. There were Judaisms. And the Judaisms were so different from one another, and they were more upset with each other than they were with anybody else. And these different versions of Judaism show up in the Gospels. So imagine the Herodians. Well, the first thing we have to realize is Jesus lived in an occupied country. His country was occupied by the Romans. And you might think of Afghanistan being occupied first by the Russians, then by the Americans. And before the Russians, they had a period of freedom. Before that, I think the British were ruling them for a while. Afghanistan has been a country with a lot of occupation. What happens when you have occupation? You have terrorists, what we call terrorists. In Jesus' day, they were called the Zealots. The Zealots in Jesus' day were known as the Sicarii. Sicarii was this clever, curved dagger. And when you joined the movement, you got the dagger, and you could conceal it because it's not a big sword. You could conceal it in your clothing. And the idea is that you might see a Roman soldier urinating against a wall. And you think, now's my moment. And you just walk up behind him, and it's this curved blade. You just put it, and you slit his throat, right? It's this idea that any one of us can become a terrorist. Easily, low cost, you don't need a lot of training, just do what you can do. And so the Zealots had this violent plan to liberate the people. The Herodians, they were the opposite. They said, are you kidding? You'll never defeat Rome. Besides, we can make a lot of money by dealing with Rome. Maybe this is God's will for the Romans to be here. And they were so opposed. You couldn't have more opposed groups than the Herodians and the Zealots. And then you had the Essenes, who we don't really see that much in the pages of the Gospels, but John the Baptist certainly had affinities with the Essenes. They would say, the temple establishment is corrupt. The Zealots are nut jobs. The only future is go out in the wilderness, wait for God to kill all those people, and then we'll be there to take over when it's all done. So you've got these radically different groups. And we could keep going. The Pharisees are another super important group who Christians, I think we tend to misunderstand. I've done this too. We just cast them as the bad guys. They were really interesting people who played a super big role after Jerusalem was destroyed. What we know about what we call Judaism today in many ways is the Judaism salvaged by the Pharisees at a time of great stress. But you've got all of these different groups, and Jesus comes in the middle of them, and he won't validate any of them. He in a sense, asks all of them to rethink everything. And I think our situation is very much like this. We have to find ways to have an alternative message that invites people to choose a different path than the path that they're sure will work. It doesn't mean you succeed, but sometimes the right kind of failure is better than the wrong kind of success. And this to me is part of our opportunity at this moment, is to try to say, let me say it like this. When the world is falling apart is a great time to have a coherent message of what a better world would look like. And that's our opportunity, I think, in these times. So I hope that's helpful. So you're making me feel really bad and really good right now. The really good part is that's the next book I'm working on. I'm starting, because this is, I think, where many of us are. The tentative title is Life After Doom. And this feeling that many of us have that the institutions that we've trusted to get us through things are now are stumbling. And how do we live when we don't see easy signs of hope? And I don't know exactly what I'm going to write in this book. I've just been sort of feeling the problem, and I'm going to start after the new year. But one of the things that's happened to me is it's made me want to take a fresh look at the subject of hope. Are you all familiar with Greta Thunberg's statement about hope? She says this quite often, the young climate activist. She says, people always come up to me and say, you young people are giving us hope. She says, I don't want your hope. She says, I want you to panic because the world is on fire. And what Greta is saying is that there's a kind of hope that gives people permission to return to their previously scheduled complacency. In other words, trend lines are looking bad. I'm anxious, I'm worried, things are bad. Oh, there's some good signs. Now I can be complacent again. And this is understandable. Our brains are like this. Our brains want to keep us on an even keel. But there's this kind of hope that seems to me to end up leading to greater trouble because we see a few encouraging signs and we then relax. It's all going to be okay. On the other hand, there's a kind of hopelessness or despair where people say, things are so bad, nothing we can do, it's all going down. I guess I can return to my previously scheduled complacency. Do you see how that kind of hope and that kind of despair lead to the same result? And the interesting thing is they increase the chances of a bad outcome because we either, because of hope or despair, lose our will to act. So I've been struggling with this, and I came across, I've been just finding any smart thing I can about hope, and one of the people who just nailed it, I thought, so perfectly was Václav Havel, the former leader of the new Czech Republic. Václav Havel says, I really should memorize this, so I'm not going to get this perfect, but this is close. Václav Havel says, hope is not an optimistic expectation that the odds are in our favor. Hope is the conviction that some things are worth doing no matter how they turn out. Some things are worth doing no matter how they turn out. And that to me is the kind of hope. In many ways, it's what we see in Jesus. Here's the irony. We call Jesus Savior, but he didn't save the world in AD 33. In the sense that there's been a lot of trouble since then. But Jesus had this deep conviction that there were some things worth saying and some things worth doing, even if it didn't look like a success. And in many ways, the Christian belief in resurrection is saying what looks like a failure is not the end of the story. And it's part of it, I think, is a way of lengthening our time frame of perspective, and saying that, well, here's how Dr. King said it. When you said about 1956, I was thinking that was a big year for Dr. King. And Dr. King was such a great example. He wasn't doing what some people said, let's burn the system down and let's get revenge for all the atrocities that have been done to our people, nor was he following what he called the white liberal or the white moderate advice, just be quiet, just be patient, everything will work out. He took a different route. He took a route different from both of those. And of course, in that speech right before his assassination, where it almost seemed like he said, I'm not going to make it to the promised land with you. There is this sense that there are things worth doing, even if it's not going to turn out great in your lifetime. You're going to live in that direction. And millions of people have lived that way through history. And this, I think, becomes our opportunity. So as I'm struggling with this for this next book, I'm trying to find a way to explore and talk about that deeper kind of hope that some things are worth doing no matter how they turn out. And this, I think, is an act of faith. It's an act of hope. And I think most of all, it's an act of love. Maybe that's a good place for me to stop, to say, to just tell you a quick anecdote. I wrote about this in my previous book, Faith After Doubt. But a couple of years ago, I was participating in a peaceful protest where I live in Southwest Florida. Our previous governor, who's now a Florida senator, was about to approve oil drilling in the Everglades. Like that's all we need, you know. So there was this company from Texas that was being given rights to drill for oil and natural gas in the Everglades. And so there were a group of us who were saying, the Everglades are protected. We need to use less fossil fuels, not more. This is such a bad idea. So I was involved in a peaceful protest, and please forgive me if you think this is terrible, but what we did was, it probably was a little bit illegal, but we were all willing to go to jail if we needed to. But what we did is our governor had a home that backed up to the Gulf of Mexico. So here's his home, and then there's a strip of public beach behind his home. So we assembled a couple miles away with a whole bunch of prefabricated building products, and we went behind his home and we built like a 20-foot high oil derrick out of wood and put it there as our peaceful protest. So be that as it may, we still don't have the oil drilling, but it's still not prevented either. So the struggle goes on. But we're walking along, and there's a woman who is just one of our really great activists in Southwest Florida. She's roughly my age. She's been at the forefront of every good cause for decades out where I live. And we're walking along, and I don't know what her religious background is, but she knows that I have a background in ministry, and she shows a lot of respect for that. And she says to me, Brian, she says, I've lost hope. I've just lost hope. I've lost hope about the climate. I've lost hope about the Everglades. I've lost hope about politics. I've just lost hope. I said, Kathleen, you're here. You're marching. You're part of this today. I said, it sounds like you haven't actually lost hope. She said, no, I've lost hope. She said, I'm not here because of hope. I'm here because of love. She said, what you love, you have to try to protect, even when you've lost hope. And I just thought, this is a lot of wisdom bubbling up right here, you know. But it's love. When you love, it's the outcome. You don't wait to see what the odds are for a good outcome. You do what you can do because it's love and it's who you are. And that, I think, is the defining moment that is here for all of us. So thank you for your attention. You've been so wonderful. I'm so happy I could be here with you. Thank you.